History is filled with weapons that promised victory and delivered ruin instead. Some were mass-produced, thrown into battle by the thousands, then forgotten as newer machines replaced them. Others were never given that chance. Military historian David Fletcher once described the Panzer VIII Maus as a machine that represented the extreme edge of ambition, where engineering brilliance collided with strategic fantasy. German engineer Karl-Heinz Münch, who worked indirectly on late-war armored projects, later admitted that Maus was less a tank and more a political statement made of steel. But what happens to such a weapon when the war that created it collapses? When the guns fall silent? When the factories stop? When the ideology behind it is crushed? What becomes of the largest tank ever built? I'm Knightley. I've spent years walking through forgotten museums, abandoned airfields and rusting depots, listening to the echoes left behind by war machines that outlived their purpose. I don't chase myths. I chase what remains. Tonight's story is not about battlefield glory. It's about aftermath. Did the Maus ever fight? Was it destroyed, captured, or hidden away? Why was something so massive built when Germany was already losing the war? And most importantly, where did it go when everything ended? This is the story of Panzer VIII Maus. Not just how it was born, but how it disappeared. Join me. The rise and legacy of Panzer VIII Maus before the war ended. The birth of a legend. Before the Panzer VIII Maus became a museum artifact, before it turned into a symbol of excess and obsession, it began as an idea born not from the battlefield, but from fear. By 1941, Germany's early victories were already slipping into memory. The swift campaigns in Poland and France had given way to grinding attrition in the Soviet Union. The Eastern Front devoured tanks at a pace no factory could sustain. German crews began encountering enemy armor that did not behave as expected, machines that survived direct hits, crossed terrain once thought impassable, and returned fire with lethal force. For German generals, this was a logistical and tactical problem. For Adolf Hitler, it was a personal affront. Hitler believed wars were won not merely through strategy, but through decisive technological dominance. Again and again, he demanded weapons that would not simply compete with enemy designs, but eclipse them entirely. He did not want parity, he wanted intimidation. This mindset created the conditions for the Maus. The Panzer VIII Maus was conceived in 1942, at a time when Germany was already overstretched. Fuel shortages were growing, raw materials were scarce. Allied bombing was beginning to cripple industrial output. And yet, resources were diverted toward a project that ignored every warning sign. The tank's mission was simple in theory. It would advance slowly but relentlessly, immune to enemy fire, crushing fortifications and absorbing punishment, while lighter units followed in its wake. It was not meant to maneuver. It was meant to end resistance through inevitability. Development was assigned primarily to Ferdinand Porsche, a designer known as much for political favor as for engineering creativity. Porsche had Hitler's ear, and that mattered more than caution. From the start, the design defied conventional logic. Weighing close to 190 metric tons, the Maus was heavier than most bridges in Europe could support. Its armor, up to 240 millimeters thick, was thicker than the main armor of some naval vessels. The main armament, a 128 millimeter cannon, was originally designed to destroy bunkers, not tanks. The Maus was not adapting to the battlefield. It was attempting to redefine it. Engineering ambition versus reality. The Maus was, in many ways, a technical marvel. Because no conventional transmission could handle its weight, engineers developed an experimental diesel-electric drive system similar to those used in locomotives. The engine powered generators, which in turn drove electric motors connected to the tracks. On paper, it was innovative. In practice, it was fragile, complex, and difficult to maintain. Cooling was a constant issue. The engine compartment overheated under sustained movement. Turning the vehicle placed immense stress on the drivetrain. Field repairs would have been nearly impossible under combat conditions. Then there was the issue of transport. The Maus could not be moved by rail without disassembly. It could not cross most bridges. To ford rivers, engineers proposed sealing the tank and running power cables from another Maus positioned on the riverbank, a solution that required multiple operational, super-heavy tanks functioning perfectly in coordination. This was engineering divorced from wartime reality. Yet development continued. Why? Because Maus was no longer just a weapon. It had become a statement, political and military motivations. By late 1942 and early 1943, Germany's strategic position was deteriorating rapidly. The defeat at Stalingrad shattered the myth of invincibility. Morale suffered. Confidence waned. The Maus offered something intangible: reassurance. To Hitler and his inner circle, projects like Maus proved that Germany still possessed technological superiority. Even if the war situation worsened, these weapons symbolized future victory. If not now, then soon. This belief overrode military objections. Several officers questioned the tank's usefulness. They argued that Germany needed reliable medium tanks, spare parts, fuel-efficient engines, and trained crews, not experimental giants that consumed enormous resources. Their concerns were ignored. In the ideological environment of Nazi Germany, practicality was often secondary to spectacle. The Maus fit perfectly into this worldview. It embodied scale, power, and domination values central to the regime's self-image. Prototypes and testing. Only 2 Maus prototypes were ever completed. The first prototype lacked a full turret and was used primarily for mobility testing. The second was equipped with the complete turret and main armament. Testing took place at facilities near Böblingen and later Kummersdorf, away from Allied bombers and prying eyes. Test reports were mixed at best. The tank could move but slowly. Acceleration was poor. Mechanical failures were frequent. Maintenance demands were extreme. Crews described operating the Maus as physically exhausting. Visibility was limited. Communication within the vehicle was difficult. Every movement felt like a negotiation between physics and machinery. Still, Hitler pushed forward. Production orders were discussed. Plans for multiple units existed on paper. None ever materialized. By the time testing concluded, Germany no longer had the industrial capacity or the time to bring the Maus into operational service. First combat deployments, a weapon that never fought the Panzer. 8. Maus never saw combat. It never fired its main gun in battle. It never faced Allied armor. It never advanced under enemy fire. This absence of combat history is not a footnote. It is central to the Maus story. Unlike the Tiger or Panther, which earned reputations through battlefield performance, the Maus existed entirely in the realm of potential. It was feared for what it might have done, not for what it actually achieved. Enemy forces adapted to many German innovations, but the Maus arrived too late, too heavy, and too impractical to force any response at all. Peak influence without a battlefield. Paradoxically, the Maus reached its peak influence without ever leaving a test range. It became iconic precisely because it represented the extreme endpoint of armored warfare escalation. When tanks can no longer become faster or cheaper, designers make them larger. When mobility fails, they rely on mass. The Maus was the logical conclusion of that mindset. Military analysts after the war would study it not as a success, but as a cautionary tale. It demonstrated how technological ambition, when detached from strategic necessity, could lead to dead ends. Collapse of the old world. By early 1945, the world that had created the Maus was collapsing. Fuel depots were empty, factories lay in ruins, armored divisions existed mostly on paper. German engineers received orders to destroy experimental equipment to prevent capture. Explosives were placed on the Maus prototypes. Damage was inflicted, but not enough. The Third Reich was ending. And then, everything stopped. The war ended. The battlefield fell silent. The ideology that demanded invincible machines collapsed under its own weight. But the story of the Panzer VIII Maus did not end there. It was about to enter a new phase 1 defined not by ambition, but by aftermath. The war ends. The fate of Panzer VIII. Maus begins chaos of surrender and seizure. The end of World War II did not arrive neatly. There was no single moment when machines shut down and soldiers walked away in orderly lines. Instead, The collapse came in fragments, factories abandoned overnight, documents burned in courtyards, weapons left where they stood because no one remained to move them. The Panzer VIII Maus was caught in that chaos. By April 1945, the two Maus prototypes were located near Kummersdorf, south of Berlin, Germany's primary testing and research complex for armored vehicles. Once a hub of innovation, it had become a place of quiet desperation. German engineers knew what was coming. Orders were issued to prevent advanced weapons from falling into enemy hands. Explosives were prepared. Sensitive documents were destroyed. The Maus, once envisioned as an unstoppable symbol of dominance, was now a liability. One prototype was partially damaged by demolition charges. Another suffered turret and hull damage. But these were hurried acts, carried out by exhausted men under collapsing command structures. There was no time, no precision, and no illusion left. The Red Army arrived soon after. Soviet forces advancing toward Berlin encountered an industrial graveyard: unfinished tanks, prototype vehicles, and scattered components. Among them was something extraordinary, a tank larger than anything they had ever seen. Initial Soviet reports described confusion and disbelief. This was not a combat vehicle abandoned in retreat. This was something else entirely experimental, excessive, and unfinished. The Maus had survived the war not because it was protected, but because no one knew what to do with it fast enough. First reactions: confusion, curiosity, control. For frontline Soviet troops, the Maus was a curiosity. It had not fought them. It had not destroyed villages or ambushed columns. It had no reputation among soldiers, yet its sheer scale commanded attention. Officers quickly realized that this was not scrap metal. This was intelligence. Word was sent up the chain of command. Engineers were requested, photographs were taken, measurements recorded. The Maus was secured, not as a trophy, but as evidence. Unlike mass-produced German tanks, which were often destroyed or stripped on the spot, the Maus was treated differently. It was isolated, guarded, studied, because the war was over. But the next one was already being imagined. The power vacuum. The collapse of Nazi Germany created a massive power vacuum, not only politically, but technologically. Across Europe, millions of tons of military equipment were suddenly unclaimed. Weapons, vehicles, prototypes, blueprints, everything was up for grabs. The Allies faced the same question everywhere: what do we keep? What do we destroy? What do we learn from? For the Panzer VIII Maus, that question was answered quickly, at least by the Soviets. Unlike the United States and Britain, who prioritized aircraft, missiles, and electronics, the Soviet Union placed enormous value on armored warfare. Tanks had carried the Red Army from Moscow to Berlin. Any insight into future armored threats mattered. The Maus represented something unique. Not a practical enemy weapon, but a glimpse into German strategic thinking at its most extreme. Destroying it would have been easy. Ignoring it would have been foolish. So the Soviets claimed it. Allied rivalries and silent boundaries. It is important to understand what did not happen. The Maus was never shared among the Allies. There was no joint evaluation, no cooperative testing, no Western engineers crawling over its armor. By 1945, trust between the Allies was already fraying. The war against Germany was ending, but suspicion between former partners was growing rapidly. The Soviets secured the Maus before American or British forces could reach Kummersdorf. And once it was in Soviet hands, it stayed there. Requests for access were denied or ignored. Information was classified. Photographs were restricted. The Maus became part of the emerging Cold War landscape, a piece of captured technology that symbolized both victory and future threat. Salvage or science. At first glance, the Maus appeared impractical, even to Soviet engineers. It was too heavy, too slow, too complex. It did not fit Soviet doctrine, which emphasized mass production, reliability, and operational simplicity. But scrapping it outright would have been a mistake. Instead, Soviet engineers approached the Maus the same way they approached captured German rockets, jet engines, and submarines, not as templates to copy, but as lessons to extract. They examined armor composition and slope, internal crew layout, ammunition storage, gun mounting and recoil systems, suspension and track design. Each element was evaluated separately. The tank as a whole was rejected, but its components were not. This distinction mattered. The Maus was not the future, but it revealed how the future could fail. Reconstruction from ruins. The two Maus prototypes were damaged differently. One had a relatively intact hull but no usable turret. The other had a functional turret but a compromised hull. Rather than preserve both in incomplete form, Soviet engineers made a deliberate choice: combine them. Using parts from both prototypes, they assembled a single display-worthy Maus. This process was not cosmetic, it was analytical. Engineers wanted a complete example to study over time, not a pile of wreckage. The work took months. The tank was then transported to Kubinka, near Moscow, home to the Red Army's primary armored research and testing facility. Moving the Maus was itself a logistical challenge. Rail lines had to be reinforced. Speed was limited. Every kilometer reminded handlers why the tank had never reached the battlefield. From weapon to artifact. At Kubinka, the Maus's role changed permanently. It was no longer a weapon. It was no longer a prototype awaiting deployment. It became an artifact. Engineers documented it thoroughly. Internal spaces were mapped. Performance estimates were recalculated based on real-world constraints rather than Nazi-era optimism. The conclusions were blunt. The Maus was impressive but strategically useless. It consumed too many resources for too little return. Its presence on a battlefield would have drawn immediate attention from aircraft and artillery. Its loss would have been catastrophic. In short, the Maus confirmed what many German officers had already suspected, but were never allowed to say aloud. A symbol reclaimed. In Soviet hands, the Maus gained a new meaning. It was no longer a symbol of German dominance. It became a symbol of German overreach. Displayed later to select audiences, it served as proof that the enemy had pursued size and spectacle at the cost of practicality and paid the price. At the same time, it quietly influenced Soviet thinking, not by encouraging larger tanks, but by reinforcing limits. Future designs emphasized balance, firepower, protection, mobility, and logistics. The Maus helped define where those limits were. The war ends. The aftermath begins. By the late 1940s, the Panzer VIII Maus had faded from immediate relevance. It would never be deployed. It would never be copied. It would never return to Germany. But it would not be forgotten. What had once been conceived as a weapon to win a war had survived only because it never entered one. The war ended. The flags changed. The borders shifted. And the Mausi-Mobile, silent and intact, entered the long afterlife of history. What had once been a machine of intimidation was now a question. What happens when ambition outpaces reality? And where do the remnants of such ambition go when the world moves on? That question leads us to the heart of the story. Where did they all go? When people ask, where did they all go? They usually imagine convoys of captured tanks shipped overseas, or forgotten hulks rusting in forests. With the Panzer VIII Maus, the truth is stranger and far more revealing. Because unlike most wartime weapons, there was never a they to begin with. Only fragments, only intentions. Only two incomplete giants born into a world that could no longer afford them. Scrapped for resources, the Maus that never existed. After World War II, Europe faced a brutal reality. Everything needed rebuilding. Cities were ruins, railways twisted metal, factories hollow shells. Steel was not history, it was survival. Across Germany and occupied territories, millions of tons of military equipment were dismantled almost immediately. Tanks were cut apart, artillery melted down, entire fleets disappeared within months. But the Maus largely escaped this fate, not because it was valued, but because it defied the system built to erase it. There were no production lines to dismantle, no operational units to scrap, no depots filled with surplus hulls. The Maus had never reached that stage. The planned production numbers, dozens, even hundreds, never moved beyond paper. By the time Germany collapsed, the industrial base required to produce Maus-class vehicles no longer existed, so nothing vanished overnight. There was nothing to vanish. Captured by major Allied powers, a divided afterlife. For most German armored vehicles, The story after surrender followed predictable paths. The United States shipped selected examples back for testing. The United Kingdom evaluated and compared designs. France reused or repurposed captured equipment. Eastern European states inherited remnants left behind, but the Maus followed a different trajectory. Only one Allied power ever truly possessed it, the Soviet Union. American and British forces never encountered the Maus intact. By the time Western allies reached central Germany, the prototypes were already under Soviet control. There were no trials at Aberdeen Proving Ground, no British firing tests, no shared evaluations. This was not an oversight, it was timing. The Maus was located deep inside territory, seized early by the Red Army. And once secured, it became classified material. To the Soviets, sharing it offered no advantage. The Maus as intelligence, not equipment. Captured German tanks like the Panther or Tiger were sometimes reused, even operated briefly by Allied forces. The Maus was different. It was never considered usable. Its fuel consumption alone made operation impractical. Spare parts did not exist. Crews required specialized training. Transport infrastructure could not support it. So the Maus was stripped of its identity as a vehicle and redefined as data. Engineers treated it like a physical document. They measured armor composition. They mapped internal volume. They studied gun recoil forces. They evaluated crew ergonomics. Each system was analyzed independently. The conclusion was clear. The Maus was an engineering dead end, but a valuable one. It showed the extreme limit of armor thickness before diminishing returns destroyed mobility. It demonstrated how excessive mass-complicated logistics more than enemy fire ever could. In that sense, the Maus was not captured to be used, but to be understood and buried. Secret programs, where the Maus disappeared from view. For several years after the war, the Maus effectively vanished from public awareness. It was not paraded. It was not displayed. It was not mentioned in propaganda films. This silence was intentional. In the late 1940s, the Soviet Union was aggressively modernizing its armored forces. New tanks were entering service. Doctrine was evolving. The Maus did not fit the narrative of progress, so it was hidden in plain sight inside Kubinka, the Soviet armored proving ground. Kubinka was not a museum at first. It was a research facility, a closed site, a place where captured technology was dissected, catalogued, and archived. The Maus sat there, intact but unseen. Reconstruction, turning two corpses into one relic. As mentioned earlier, the Soviets made a calculated decision. Rather than preserve both damaged prototypes, they would create a single complete example. This required mating the intact turret from one prototype with the more structurally sound hull of the other, rebuilding internal systems to static display condition. This act alone erased part of the Maus's physical history. From that moment on, there was no longer Prototype 1 and Prototype 2. There was only the Maus. Everything else ceased to exist. Museum preservation from classified to exhibit. Decades later, Kubinka transformed. What was once a secret research site gradually became a museum. Selected vehicles were placed on public display, not as threats, but as historical artifacts. The Maus emerged from secrecy as a curiosity. Visitors stood beneath its gun barrel. Children posed next to its tracks. Historians debated its meaning. But by then, the story had already narrowed. Most people saw it as the biggest tank ever built, a Nazi superweapon, a failed experiment. Few understood the full chain of decisions that led to its creation and survival. Battlefield relics and abandoned survivors. Why none exist? For many German weapons, traces remain scattered across Europe. Wrecks in forests, hulks in rivers, turrets embedded in concrete. Not the Maus. There are no battlefield relics because there was no battlefield. There are no underwater wrecks because it was never deployed. No abandoned hulks because it was never issued. No derelicts because it never moved far enough to be lost. The Maus left no physical footprint beyond its testing grounds. That absence is significant. Most war machines become history through destruction. The Maus became history through avoidance. Rumors, myths, and false sightings over the years, rumors surfaced. Claims of Additional Maus hulls hidden underground, secret production runs, lost prototypes buried near factories. None are supported by evidence. German wartime records are fragmentary, but consistent on this point. Only 2 Maus prototypes were ever completed. No third hull, no operational unit, no hidden reserve. The myth persists because the Maus feels like something that should have existed in greater numbers, but it didn't. A weapon that went nowhere and everywhere. So where did they all go? They didn't go anywhere. They stopped. The Panzer VIII Maus did not scatter across continents like other weapons. It did not fragment into dozens of post-war stories. It condensed into a single object, a monument to excess. One tank, one location, one unresolved question. Was it a warning or a temptation? Because even today, the Maus continues to fascinate designers, gamers, historians, and engineers. Not as a solution, but as a boundary. It shows how far ambition can go before collapsing under its own weight. And that influence, quiet, indirect, persistent, is where the Maus truly went. Not into battlefields, but into memory. And from there, into the designs, doctrines, and decisions of the post-war world. That influence is subtle, but it is everywhere. And that brings us to the next chapter, the impact on the world that followed. Impact on the post-war world. Influence on new military technology. At first glance, the Panzer VIII Maus appears to have left no descendants. No nation built a direct successor. No Cold War tank approached its mass. No doctrine embraced the idea of the super-heavy breakthrough vehicle. But influence in military history does not always travel forward through imitation. Sometimes it moves through rejection. After 1945, armored designers across the world faced a new reality. Wars would no longer be decided by single, invulnerable machines. They would be decided by systems logistics, air power, combined arms, and industrial capacity. The Maus confirmed this shift with brutal clarity. Engineers studying the Maus, particularly in the Soviet Union, came to a consistent conclusion. Beyond a certain threshold, additional armor provided diminishing returns. Once a vehicle reached extreme mass, every gain in protection created exponential costs in mobility, maintenance, and strategic flexibility. This lesson directly influenced post-war tank philosophy. Cold War designs moved toward balance, armor thick enough to survive hits, not absorb everything. Guns powerful enough to defeat enemies, not demolish fortresses. Engines designed for reliability and range, not spectacle. The Maus demonstrated the danger of optimizing for a single variable invulnerability while ignoring the battlefield as a whole. Even the Soviet Union, which had captured and studied the Maus in detail, rejected super-heavy tank concepts shortly after the war. Late-war Soviet heavy tanks already pushed the limits of weight and logistics. The Maus made it clear that pushing further would lead nowhere. Instead, designers refined mobility, crew ergonomics, and production efficiency. The Maus did not inspire bigger tanks. It inspired restraint. Doctrinal lessons, from monuments to networks. Before the Second World War, many military planners still believed in decisive weapons machines that could, by their presence alone, break enemy resistance. The Maus was the final expression of that belief. Post-war doctrine abandoned it. NATO and Warsaw Pact planners increasingly emphasized combined arms warfare. Tanks were no longer expected to operate as solitary titans. They were nodes in a network supported by infantry, artillery, engineers, and air power. The Maus, when examined in this context, appeared isolated and blind. Its size made concealment impossible. Its speed made reaction slow. Its logistics made sustained operations unrealistic. In theoretical Cold War scenarios, a Maus-like vehicle would not have been destroyed by enemy tanks. It would have been destroyed by aircraft, missiles, or simply bypassed. This realization shaped how armored forces were organized and deployed for decades. Psychological impact on veterans and engineers. For those who worked on the Maus, the post-war years brought a different kind of reckoning. German engineers interviewed after the war often described the Maus with mixed emotions. Pride in technical achievement coexisted with quiet acknowledgement of futility. Some admitted that they had known the project was impractical, but continued because refusal was not an option. For veterans, The Maus became a symbol of how disconnected leadership had become from reality. While crews fought and died in lighter, underpowered vehicles, vast resources were invested in a tank that never reached them. That disconnect haunted post-war memory. In the Soviet Union, the Maus was viewed less emotionally but no less symbolically. It represented an enemy that had pursued technological dominance without understanding its limits. Engineers who studied it remembered it not as a threat, but as a warning. Cultural impact, from fear to fascination. As decades passed, the Maus transitioned from classified artifact to cultural icon. Books and documentaries presented it as the largest tank ever built, a symbol of Nazi excess, a marvel of impractical engineering. Scale models appeared. Video games resurrected it as a playable weapon. Online debates argued endlessly about whether it could have worked under different circumstances. This fascination says less about the Maus itself and more about human attraction to extremes. The Maus embodies the question, what happens when there are no constraints? In popular culture, it is often stripped of context. It becomes a what-if machine removed from the collapsing economy, fuel shortages and strategic failures that made it impossible. But serious historians consistently return to the same conclusion. The Maus was not ahead of its time. It was out of time. 5. Propaganda and political meaning. For the victorious powers, captured German weapons served political purposes. In the West, advanced German aircraft and rockets were used to demonstrate technological superiority, inherited through victory. In the East, captured armor symbolized triumph over fascism and industrial domination. The Maus fit awkwardly into both narratives. It was too impractical to showcase as a weapon, too flawed to celebrate as progress, too large to ignore entirely. So it became a quiet exhibit rather than a loud symbol. When displayed, it was not framed as a danger narrowly avoided, but as proof that Nazi Germany had pursued grandeur instead of sustainability. In this sense, the Maus became part of post-war moral storytelling. It illustrated how authoritarian systems often prioritize spectacle over effectiveness and pay the price. Influence on modern military thinking. Modern militaries still study failures, not to repeat them, but to understand the conditions that produced them. The Maus appears in professional military education not as a blueprint, but as a case study. It is discussed alongside other examples of over-engineering, misaligned incentives, and leadership-driven design. The lesson is not never innovate. The lesson is know why you are innovating. Technology must serve strategy, not ideology, ego, or symbolism. The Maus violated that principle at every stage. The lingering presence today, the Panzer VIII Maus sits silently in a museum. It no longer threatens. It no longer teaches through fear. It teaches through existence. Standing beside it, one feels the weight not just of steel but of decisions. Decisions made far from the battlefield. Decisions insulated from consequence. Decisions that mistook size for strength. The war ended long ago, but the presence of the Maus lingers, shaping how engineers think, how historians write, and how militaries remember. The engine stopped. The gun fell silent. Yet its lesson continues to move quietly through the post-war world. And in the next chapter, we confront what remains today, the final survivors. A catalogue of remaining units. When historians speak of surviving war machines, they usually refer to collections, rows of tanks, squadrons of aircraft, scattered relics across continents. The Panzer VIII Maus does not allow for that language. There is no fleet. There is no series. There is only one. Today, the only surviving Panzer VIII Maus exists at the Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow. It stands assembled from the remains of the two original prototypes, a single body created from fragments of an abandoned ambition. This is not restoration in the romantic sense. The Maus at Kubinka does not run. Its engine does not roar. Its systems are inert. What remains is form, scale, and presence. And presence is enough. There are no other intact hulls, no spare turrets, no private collections hiding a forgotten Maus in a warehouse. Unlike other German vehicles that were captured, sold, or restored by enthusiasts decades later, the Maus never entered the civilian world. It remained under state control from the moment it was seized. Its survival is singular and intentional. Why the Maus was preserved at all given its impracticality? One might ask why the Maus survived when so many other vehicles were scrapped. The answer lies in symbolism rather than utility. To Soviet authorities, the Maus was never a candidate for reuse. It was too heavy, too complex, and too detached from Soviet doctrine. But it was valuable in another way. It represented the endpoint of an enemy's thinking. Preserving the Maus allowed future generations to see physically how ideology can distort engineering. It became a reference object, a three-dimensional cautionary tale. Destroying it would have erased that lesson. Keeping it preserved the evidence. The Maus as a static relic over time, the Maus transitioned fully from research artifact to museum exhibit. This transition changed its relationship with the public. Visitors no longer approached it as a potential weapon. They approached it as an anomaly, a machine that seems to challenge intuition, too large to feel real, too heavy to imagine moving. Standing beside it, the viewer does not think of tactics or firepower. They think of limits. The Maus does not inspire fear, it inspires disbelief, and that reaction is precisely why it remains valuable. The value of the survivor today. In monetary terms, the Maus is effectively priceless. It cannot be sold. It cannot be duplicated. It cannot be replaced. But its true value lies elsewhere. For historians, it is a fixed reference point. Measurements taken decades ago can be revisited. Assumptions can be tested against physical reality. For engineers, it is a reminder that complexity must serve purpose. Every cable, every plate of armor, every mechanical compromise visible inside the Maus tells a story of trade-offs pushed too far. For the public, it is scale made tangible. Books and diagrams cannot convey what standing next to 188 tons of steel does to perspective. The Maus compresses abstraction into reality, private collections and the absence thereof. Some weapons survive because they are desirable. Collectors seek them, museums compete for them, restorers bring them back to life. The Maus was never part of that ecosystem. It was too large to transport, too politically sensitive to sell, too incomplete to restore meaningfully. Even if private ownership had been permitted, which it was not, the practical challenges would have been insurmountable. The Maus survived because it was left alone, not because it was circulated. Derelict relics that do not exist. Many viewers expect hidden remains, half-buried hulls, forgotten turrets, rusting frames in forests or lakes. With the Maus, there are none. The testing grounds were controlled environments. The prototypes never dispersed. There were no combat losses, no field abandonments, no emergency retreats that left wrecks behind. Every significant component was accounted for. This absence of scattered remnants makes the Maus unusual among wartime artifacts. Its history is centralized, contained, and closed. The mystery of the missing units. Despite the clear historical record, rumors persist. Stories of additional hulls buried underground, claims of secret production runs halted at the last moment, speculation about incomplete frames hidden near factories. None withstand scrutiny. German wartime documentation, fragmentary as it is, shows no evidence of further Maus production beyond the two prototypes. Allied intelligence reports align with this conclusion. The mystery, then, is not about missing vehicles. It is about missing restraint. A survivor without a lineage. Most surviving military machines belong to families, variants, evolutions. The Maus does not. It has no ancestors worth mentioning and no descendants at all. It exists as a terminal point and end point, where a particular way of thinking stopped. That is what makes it unsettling. It survived not because it succeeded, but because it failed before it could do harm. The loneliness of survival. The Maus stands alone, not in a battlefield cemetery, not among rows of similar machines, but isolated, oversized, and silent. Its survival is not a victory, it is a reminder that history sometimes preserves its mistakes, not to glorify them, but to ensure they are seen. And with that lone survivor in mind, we arrive at the end of the journey, not at destruction, not at triumph, but at understanding, which brings us to the final chapter. Conclusion. War machines are built to dominate moments. History is shaped by what survives those moments. The Panzer VIII Maus was designed to rule a battlefield that no longer existed by the time it was ready. It was conceived in fear, shaped by ideology, and sustained by the belief that size could compensate for loss of control. When the war ended, the Maus did not meet destruction in combat. It met irrelevance, and that perhaps is the most revealing fate of all. Throughout this story, we followed the Maus from conception to collapse, from a vision of invulnerability to a static relic behind museum barriers, not as a hero, not even as a villain, but as a case study in how ambition, when left unchecked, can outgrow its purpose. The Maus did not fail because engineers lacked skill. On the contrary, it failed despite extraordinary technical competence. Its designers solved problems that should never have existed: how to move nearly 200 tons of steel, how to power it, how to protect it beyond reason. What they could not solve was context. Wars are not won by the biggest weapon on paper. They are won by systems, production lines, supply chains, trained crews, adaptable doctrine. The Maus ignored all of these. It asked the battlefield to adapt to it. The battlefield never did. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the Maus was already obsolete, not technologically, but conceptually. And yet, it survived. It survived because it never had the chance to fail publicly. It was never shattered under air attack, never immobilized by fuel shortages mid-battle, never abandoned by crews who could not move it. Its survival preserved the illusion longer than destruction would have. As I walk through museums and archival halls, I often find that the most powerful artifacts are not those with long combat records, but those that reveal intention. The Maus reveals intention in its purest form. Every plate of armor, every overbuilt system, every compromise carved into steel reflects a decision made far from the front lines. Decisions made in conference rooms. Decisions insulated from consequence. Decisions driven by belief rather than evidence. This is why the Maus matters, not because it could have changed the war, but because it shows how wars distort judgment. In the post-war world, the Maus became a quiet teacher. Engineers studied it to understand limits. Strategists cited it as an example of misaligned priorities. Historians used it to illustrate the dangers of technological absolutism. It influenced tanks that were never built, doctrines that were never adopted, assumptions that were never repeated. Its impact is invisible, but persistent. Today, the Maus sits motionless. Its gun points nowhere. Its engine will never start again. Children look up at it with wonder. Adults shake their heads at its excess. Few feel threatened by it anymore. And that transformation from terror to curiosity is itself a form of victory over the ideology that created it. As the narrator of this journey, I don't stand beside the Maus to admire it. I stand beside it to listen, because every relic speaks. The Maus speaks of a moment when fear drove escalation, when leaders believed that overwhelming force could replace strategy, when the answer to every problem was bigger. Those echoes are not confined to the past. They appear whenever complexity is mistaken for strength, whenever innovation becomes a substitute for judgment, whenever technology is asked to solve problems rooted in policy, leadership, or ethics. That is why these stories matter, not to glorify destruction, but to understand it. As I travel through forgotten testing grounds, decaying bunkers, and silent museum halls, I am reminded that history is not a straight line of progress. It is a series of experiments, some successful, many disastrous. The Maus was one of those experiments, and like all experiments, it left data behind. The war ended, nations rebuilt, new conflicts emerged, new machines replaced old ones. But the Maus remained unchanged, unmoving and unresolved. It asks a simple question of everyone who studies it. How far is too far? There is no single answer, but there is a responsibility to remember that power without purpose leads nowhere. If you've stayed with me through this journey from ambition to aftermath, I thank you. These stories exist because people still care about the lessons hidden inside steel and silence. If you want to continue exploring the forgotten edges of history with lost prototypes, abandoned weapons, and the echoes they leave behind, join me. There are countless stories waiting to be uncovered, And as always, I want to hear from you. What machine, to what moment, what forgotten idea should we examine next? Until then, this is Knightley, walking away from a giant that never moved and carrying forward the lesson it left behind.